Last lecture. First of all, I should introduce myself. I want to tell you just a little bit about myself and tell you that I want to talk for about 40 minutes. And if I get to a point where I see the clock and I'm running behind, which probably will happen, I'll cut. I've got a large cut that I can make, and we'll make it so that it will run about 40 minutes or so. I personally have another lecture reading that I have to be at 8 o'clock in Stackhouse. Some of you also, I hope, will go there. That's Dr. Rafael Campo is giving a reading. So I'm very happy to try to do it all and you know, do it upright for Eduardo. And come in. So we'll see how it goes. This is all part of being the first of the last. So, that's good. All right, so get this. I've been here since 1984. The last year of all men. I could spend the next 40 minutes telling you horror stories of what that was like. Oh, some of them are kind of funny. But I won't. I've been here since 1984. This is my 25th year here. I teach American literature, mostly 19th century, and environmental literature, also mostly 19th century, though I venture into the 20th century. One of my favorite writers is a man named Barry Lopez, who is alive and well today, who is 64 years old. So some contemporary work as well. I've lived in a lot of places before I got to this place. Even though I've been in this place 25 years, I lived first year of my life I lived in Texas. I was born in Texas, in Bryan, Texas, which is right next to College Station, where Texas A&M is. My dad was teaching there, and then my father got a position teaching animal science at Auburn University in Auburn, Alabama. And so I grew up in Auburn, Alabama, a very small little town at that point, about the size of Lexington, though now it's more the size of Charlottesville and more like Charlottesville than it is anything else. I went to Auburn as an undergraduate. I was one of 6 boys, and one of the things about that is, you know, we were, our family was an academic family in a way, but we didn't have a whole lot of money, and so, you know, there wasn't a whole lot of possibility of going off to school anywhere. So we went to school where we grew up. And so I grew up in Auburn, and I had my childhood and youth there, and then I had my college years there as well. I like to say to people that I'm probably the only person you know with a PhD from Yale University in English literature who also took feeds and feeding and biochemistry of animal nutrition, which I did. I thought I might be an animal sciences major at one point. I change majors every fall, just like the leaves change. But I finished up at Auburn, and I went to France for 2 years. I lived in a little town, city, Angers, France. It's in the west of France, and worked for a Catholic priest who was a wonderful man who edited a journal of Renaissance humanism, Christian humanism, about St. Thomas More and those who were in his circle. And for 2 years I worked learning French and Latin and English with this little man who's now in his mid to late 80s, learned an awful lot from him. And from there, I went to New Haven, Connecticut, and spent 4 years, and I felt many times more like a foreign student in New Haven than I'd ever felt in France. And after 4 years of graduate school at Yale University, one of the most magnificent universities in the world, for which I am ever grateful. Wonderful, wonderful place. I went for 2 years to Geneva, Switzerland, and taught English there at the University of Geneva. And that was one of the greatest gigs of my life. 2 classes a week. Kids hardly wrote anything. Oral examinations twice a year. Wow. Those Europeans have got it figured out, how to do education right. And from there, I came to Rockbridge County in 1984 and have been here ever since. And so I've lived in this place more than any other place in my life, even though I'm very, in some ways you might say, well-traveled and have been to a lot of different places. I learned just a couple of weeks ago that I would be giving this lecture, this last lecture, and that in fact I had been diagnosed with a terminal condition. And it was a shock. But I've adjusted to that fact, and that I have to confront my own mortality tonight, and I ask you to do that with me. It's not easy to do. Most of you would agree with me, it is not easy to do, to think about your own mortality. It's plenty easy to avoid those kinds of thoughts. I think about mortality as an abstraction a lot. I teach literature, after all. We talk about death all the time. We talk about it as a general condition, the human condition, the fact that makes beauty possible. But to think of it as my condition, to think of terminus, end, final point, that's not easy to do. That's not easy to hold in your mind. I think at most the fact of death lurks in the back of one's mind. That once in a while it comes forward when you catch the wheel and say, oh my God, I could have died. Or some other context, and suddenly you're struck by that fact of your own mortality. Not the fact of mortality, the fact of your mortality. Very difficult. Very rare to have that thought. So at most, it sort of is at the edge of consciousness. Certainly not a concretely imagined reality, though it's a reality for everyone in this room. So, as a result, I've had to think well and furthermore quickly, after only a couple of weeks' notice, about the place we occupy in this world. And since I wanted to end my time here tonight with a few words that might somehow stay among you, among the living, after I'm gone, all of these thoughts and words then come under the shadow of death, every one of them, please. If you find yourself wandering in thought and imagination, you will. You can't hear everything I say tonight. You'll wander, wool gather, Of course you will. We all do. I do it every week in silence for an hour. When I worship, I'm in silence and my mind wanders like crazy. If I said to myself in that hour, think about your own mortality, think about it, think about it, think about it, think about it, I couldn't do it for an hour. So your mind will wander. But everything I say tonight is under the shadow of death. So first of all, I want to open with an epigraph. This is all like, oh man, it's 11 after. I'm in trouble already. I'm going to open with an epigraph from one of my favorite poets, Emily Dickinson. One of her great poems from 1862, a great year for her, in which she wrote almost a poem a day. This poem reflects on the experience of living in the shadow of death. Here we go. 8 lines. Nature sometimes sears a sapling, sometimes scalps a tree. Her green people recollect it when they do not die. Fainter leaves to further seasons dumbly testify. We who have souls die oftener, not so vitally. So, immediately, even before I really even begin, you can see in this poem that death and the thought of death is as much a figurative experience as a literal one. It occurs in the soul as much as in the body. It happens repeatedly, not just once. Lightning strikes more times than we can count. But the unspoken message in Dickinson's poem, I think, is that such dying leads us to testify, not dumbly like the green people, but in words, spoken aloud. So the title of my lecture tonight, we're almost at 7:15. The title is The Place of the Imagination. And the first term of my meditations was mortality, our mortality, each and every one of us. But in addition to thinking about that, I've tried to think as hard as I can about a couple of things I think about a lot and think are exceptionally important to all of us. And those are place and the role of the imagination. And then a final underlying theme, I hope I get to it, is the role of time. Role of time in our lives and in how we imagine place. Okay, so to start, place. Place of the imagination. Place is a central experience for me in my life. This place, in my thought, in my teaching, I try to teach the value of place and a sense of place. This word place, fascinating. It reveals a complex play of literal meanings and figural meanings. The fundamental literal meaning of place is an open space in a city, a square, a marketplace. That meaning comes from the Latin term platea. The word also signifies material place, both general and specific. And in most of those senses, it suggests a dwelling place for human beings. Third, place signifies a position in some scale, some order, some series. So for example, I got first place in the race in an athletic competition. What number occupies the first, second, or third place in an arithmetical progression. It can mean a position with reference to the occupation or occupant, such as the proper place for definitions, like the definitions I'm giving you. The word functions in a host of phrases to create specific meanings for other nouns. For example, I wrote a book a couple of years ago, and I called it The Place of Nature. And in the title of my lecture, The Place of the Imagination, I used the same kind of figurative meaning. So my point is that the word place creates a huge network of meanings and usages, so huge that the editors of the Oxford English Dictionary call the meanings of place, quote, very numerous and difficult to arrange. Now, if the editors of the OED say that, then you can bet it's very complicated. And then what I want to say next is that like the definitions of the word itself, the concept of place is very flexible and elusive. It's very dynamic and very hard to hold in one spot, one place. And one of the people I find very, very interesting in this regard is a literary critic who teaches at Harvard, Lawrence Buell, who I seen teach in this very room a few years ago. And he talks about 5 dimensions of place, or what he calls place connectedness. What I call, in a very common phrase, a sense of place. First of all, he talks about place as a figure of concentric zones of affiliation. Zones that decrease in intimacy the farther that you fan out from the original central focus. So we tend to be more intimately connected to a place like our home or our neighborhood, our town or our county, our region, and so forth. Second of all, he talks about the experience of place involving both the far and the near, so that our sense of place involves what he calls a whole archipelago of locales. In my own life, for example, as I suggested at the beginning, I've been very connected to European countries and to European languages. But I'm also very much a creature of the Deep South. And then recently, I've been connected very strongly to the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York and to the White Mountains of New Hampshire, both of which I've hiked extensively in winter and in summer. Third, places are not stable, permanent entities. Instead, places are unstable processes that occur over time, both on a communal level and on an individual level. Think about this place, Washington and Lee University. This school is so different from the way it was in 1984 when I arrived here. My experience of it is so specific to the last 25 years, to coeducation, to the development of programs and faculty and students in new ways. This place is in many ways a function of people you have only heard of, people who are gone now, people who have already died. One of the most important people in giving me a sense of this place was John Elrod. But John Elrod was actually a newcomer here in 1984 when I was a newcomer here. Now, his name is on the commons. His picture is in the living room. What he stood for has become a central part of the physical and intellectual place itself. I think that's remarkable. Fourth, the sense of place is a composite of all the places that have been significant over time to a person or to a people. That is once again to think of place as both community and as individual. So, for example, my sense of Washington and Lee University is not only mine, nor is my sense of place only attached to Washington and Lee University. An individual becomes a kind of nexus, a kind of layered or imbricated composite of places and experiences over time. The people who live and work here all form a similar imbrication, a similar overlapping composite of all the places that have signified important things for them over the time of their lives. That sense of place, incredibly complex as it may seem, is a large part of the rich texture that we feel in such a place as this. When you find yourself walking around in this place and you say, man, I don't know what it is about this place. That's what it is. That's what it is. This is exactly what is missing in every generic roadside restaurant and chain store you walk into. If not utterly missing, it is what is so damaged and hidden and submerged by the utter sameness, the deadening interchangeability of every Walmart and fast food joint that you have ever walked into. Fifth, and finally, the sense of place also includes fictive and virtual worlds, fictive and virtual places, as well as real physical places. Unseen, actual places, and imagined utopian places exercise a powerful influence on our sense of place. In my imagination, personally, and again, this is all under the shadow of my own personal death, so I'm indulging myself by giving you my own personal parts of this. But in my own imagination, the Arctic is always present. The Arctic is always present. I'm from South Alabama. The Arctic is always present in my imagination. Partly because of my repeated readings of the work of Barry Lopez, and especially of his amazing work, his great work, Arctic Dreams, which, if you remember nothing else from my last lecture, please write that down as a title and read it repeatedly. I've never been to the Arctic. I've never been close to the Arctic. I've never seen a polar bear, even though that charismatic top predator lurks in my imagination all the time. My sense of the earth as an amazingly fertile and vulnerable place connects directly and deeply to a never seen, never experienced Arctic. In other ways, it connects directly and deeply to Herman Melville and to Herman Melville's novel Moby Dick, to the whaling ship the Pequod, to the articulate seaman Ishmael, another orphan, as he calls himself, who tells this encyclopedic tale of Ahab's supernatural revenge upon the white whale. Not a utopian place by any means, but definitely an imagined place. The great oceans teeming with huge mammals in the 19th century, hunting the far corners of the world. Here's Ishmael's meditation in the chapter Brit, chapter 58 of Moby Dick. His meditation on two places, sea and land. Consider the subtleness of the sea, how its most dreaded creatures glide underwater, unapparent for the most part and treacherously hidden beneath the loveliest tints of azure. Consider also the devilish brilliance and beauty of many of its most remorseless tribes, as the dainty embellished shape of many species of sharks. Consider once more the universal cannibalism of the sea, all whose creatures prey upon each other, carrying on eternal war since the world began. Consider all this, and then turn to this green, gentle, and most docile earth. Consider them both, the sea and the land. And do you not find a strange analogy to something in yourself? For as this appalling ocean surrounds the verdant land, so in the soul of man there lies one insular Tahiti, full of peace and joy, but encompassed by all the horrors of the half-known life. God keep thee. Push not off from that isle. Thou canst never return. Ishmael, brave, imaginative narrator, but he warns the reader to be less brave, more prudent, to stay on that one insular Tahiti full of peace and joy. What can we do with that warning? The novel portrays all the horrors of the half-known life, but surely the horrors make the island of Tahiti, in a human soul, a place of refuge, a place of peace and joy. Without those horrors, without the sea, the island does not exist. The imagination needs to explore the depths of the ocean as well as the verdant land. We have to imagine our own personal death. And if we could actually do that every day, every moment of every day, every minute, it would be like prayer without ceasing. Second term in my title, imagination. That speaks directly to my career as a professor of literature and of literary writing. But it also expands to a larger sense of knowledge and wisdom and sense of place. So, as with place, the term place, the term imagination, very interesting in its many definitions and meanings. And so I turned once again to the OED. And we find a basic definition of imagination as the action of imagining. Don't you love it when it's so circular? The action of imagining, or forming a mental concept of what is not actually present to the senses. The result of this process, a mental image or idea. Other meanings like that basic sense of forming a mental image of what is not present come up. So, for example, the third definition, that faculty of the mind by which are formed images or concepts of external objects not present to the senses, and of their relations to each other or to the subject, hence frequently including memory. This is one of my pet concepts or theories, is which won't alarm anyone in the room, and that is that the memory is completely involved and imbricated with imagination. Nobody's memory is this recording of the way things work. It's totally imaginative. What do you remember about such and such a class as opposed to what I remember? Totally different experiences and imaginations and so forth, right? I've had many a conversation with my best brother, who's an Episcopal priest, who should tell the truth. And his memories of some of our fights are horrendous. There you go. A fourth meaning, the power which the mind has of forming concepts beyond those derived from external objects. The operation of fantastic thought, fancy. The creative faculty of the mind in its highest aspect. The power of framing new and striking intellectual conceptions. Poetic genius. Now there you go. Those of you who are literary students, you say, yeah, that's where we live. Perhaps the most famous example of that last meaning occurs in Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. And as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Note how imagination creates places and creates names. A local habitation is a place of dwelling for the imagination, where things unknown can assume a concrete form, created by the names, the poet's words. But the imagination I want to hasten to add is not only the poet's. My own favorite from this list of illustrations in the OED is from Charles Darwin's 1871 book, The Descent of Man. Here's what Darwin says. The imagination is one of the highest prerogatives of man. By this faculty he unites independently of the will former images and ideas, and thus creates brilliant and novel results. The combination of these meanings suggests that the imagination can slide into the unreal or fantastic by leaving reality too far behind. But if it is used wisely, it is capable of creating brilliant and novel results. So the combination of Shakespeare and Darwin is also suggestive. It indicates that the supposed gap between science and literature is less wide than some might suppose. In my own scholarship, most recent scholarship, especially on the writer John Burroughs, I've tried to define that specific combination as the scientific imagination. I want to say a few words about that. John Burroughs, many of you have never heard of, 1837 to 1921, was the most prolific and popular nature writer in 19th century America. He was even more popular than Henry David Thoreau. In fact, Thoreau became popular because John Burroughs taught the American public to appreciate nature essays. People did not read Thoreau in 1870. They read Burroughs, and then he taught them to read Thoreau. Burroughs wrote a variety of essays, of kinds of essays. He wrote simple descriptions, beautiful descriptions of walks in the country. He wrote narratives about birds, about their behaviors. He wrote literary essays about poetry, about the relationship of poetry to nature. He especially wrote a series of essays in 2 books on the poetry of Walt Whitman. He wrote philosophical essays on poetry and the place of human beings in the world. And so I want to mention a couple of essays of his, of John Burroughs and Charles Darwin. In the 1880s, Burroughs wrote an essay called Science and Literature. And he figured Charles Darwin in that essay as embodying the scientific imagination. He drew a sharp distinction to begin with in the essay between scientific and literary approaches to nature. Science, he said, is concerned with knowledge, it is democratic, and it is materialistic. Literature is concerned with enjoyment, it's aristocratic, and it's sensual. But Burroughs argued that these two approaches actually should merge because, as he says, and I'm quoting him, the final value of physical science is its capability to foster in us noble ideals, to lead us to new and larger views of moral and spiritual truths. Value for Burroughs necessarily entails emotion and imagination, as he says, until science is mixed with emotion and appeals to the heart and the imagination, it is like dead inorganic matter. And when it becomes so mixed and so transformed, it is literature. So Burroughs describes Charles Darwin as a figure of transformation, a scientist who reaches toward literary writing in his work. He praises Darwin for his lively conception of things, opposing a mechanical conception of the universe. Darwin, Burroughs claims, is full of what we may call the sentiment of science, an early formulation for what I call the scientific imagination. All of his works, says Burroughs, have a human and poetic side. They are undoubtedly the best feeders of literature we have yet had from the field of science. That's John Burroughs on Charles Darwin's work. Burroughs finds a literary and poetic foundation to the origin of species, to the descent of man, and especially to the voyage of the Beagle. And he praises Charles Darwin as a writer for his candor, his mastery, his faith, insight, imagination, prophecy, inspiration, and love of truth. By the end of this essay, Science and Literature, Darwin becomes a completely heroic figure in Burroughs' view. Both his poetic and religious emotions, says Burroughs, as well as his scientific proclivities, found full scope, and his demonstration becomes almost a song. It is easy to see how such a mind as Goethe's would have followed him and supplemented him, not from its wealth of scientific lore, but from its poetic insight into the methods of nature. My goodness, Darwin is no Goethe, but he could easily be mistaken for a Goethe, mistaken for a Humboldt, mistaken for a Shakespeare. So Burroughs represents Charles Darwin as a masterful writer because he combines science and literature. And he sees this especially in The Origin of Species, which those of you who know Darwin know is not nearly so well written a piece as Voyage of the Beagle, is not nearly so compelling a narrative or a literary piece of writing. He calls The Origin of Species a wonder book or masterpiece. He says, there are few pages in modern scientific literature so noble as those last few pages of that book. Everything about Darwin indicates the master, says Burroughs. In reading him, you breathe the air of the largest and most serene mind. The last pages of The Origin justify that enthusiastic response. Darwin's final chapter of Origin of Species is called Recapitulation and Conclusion, not a great title. But he takes the reader through the main arguments supporting the theory of natural selection and then turns to the large conclusions that result from this one long argument. In that final section, Darwin casts his eyes toward the future, where, as he says, we can dimly foresee that there will be a considerable revolution in natural history. Repeatedly employing the image of opening, Darwin looks across biological fields to geology, to psychology, to anthropology. He predicts that fields will open for far more important researches than those he himself has made. He insists on the main argument of the origin, that species do not arise from special creation, but that their lineal descent from previous species ennobles them and secures their future in a perpetual process of transformation. That is his argument. But then he reaches this final famous concluding paragraph, the passage that Burroughs finds so noble and which I want to read to you. Here is Charles Darwin's conclusion to the origin of species. It is interesting to contemplate an entangled bank, clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing on the bushes, with various insects flitting about, and with worms crawling through the damp earth, and to reflect that these elaborately constructed forms, so different from each other and dependent on each other in so complex a manner, have all been produced by laws acting around us. These laws, taken in the largest sense, being growth with reproduction, inheritance, which is almost implied by reproduction, variability from the indirect and direct action of the external conditions of life, from use and disuse, a ratio of increase so high as to lead to a struggle for life, and as a consequence to natural selection, entailing divergence of character and the extinction of less improved forms. Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely, the production of the higher animals, directly follows. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that while this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. This entangled bank fittingly evokes this complex but familiar natural world all around us. We experience it always, but we rarely reflect on the laws governing. Darwin provokes our capacity for reflection by capitalizing those laws that act around us, taking on the largest sense of the laws and his own reflections on them. Then he formulates his vision of transformation. War, famine, death lead to conception, production, and life. The vision is one of power. The vision is one of grandeur. But Darwin's formulation is equally grand, equally powerful. The transforming style of this passage, in effect, passes from so simple a beginning to endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful. I do have a section on John Burroughs, and I do wish to, I wish I could, in my limited time on earth, to read this section to you, but I'm worried that in doing so I will lose the opportunity to read something else that I want to read even more. And so I'm going to skip a little bit. And I want to say that in his response to Charles Darwin, John Burroughs, this wonderful nature writer and philosophical writer of the late 19th and early 20th century, understands and thinks through the entangled bank of Charles Darwin's last paragraph as a complex place of science and literature, a complex place of knowledge and wisdom, of life and death, and that is, the entangled bank is the place of the imagination. And so what I've done then is to talk you through 3 words that I live with every day, some better than others. Mortality, place, imagination. And I think to think of those 3, mortality, place, and the imagination, raises fundamental questions about our place in the world and the qualities of the world in which we live and move and have our being. I promised at the beginning I have one last term to add to my list, though it doesn't come in last place. That is the word time and the role of time. And so what I want to do, I think I have about 13 minutes. And what I'd like to do is try to read a good hunk of Walt Whitman's poem, To Think of Time. He wrote it in 1855. It's one of the original untitled 12 poems in the original 1855 edition of Leaves of Grass. In later editions, he called it Burial Poem, Burial, and then finally To Think of Time. So it's thematically appropriate. For Whitman, as for other great 19th century figures of imagination that I've been mentioning tonight, Emily Dickinson, Herman Melville, John Burroughs, and Charles Darwin, mortality, place, and the imagination are completely involved in the experience of time. 121 lines, and we'll see how much of it I read. I will stop at 8, if not sooner. To think of time. It's in 9 sections, but I won't say section 1, section 2, I'll just read it. To think of time, of all that retrospection. To think of today and the ages continued henceforward. Have you guessed you yourself would not continue? Have you dreaded those earth beetles? Have you feared the future would be nothing to you? Is today nothing? Is the beginningless past nothing? If the future is nothing, they are just as surely nothing. To think that the sun rose in the east, that men and women were flexible, real, alive, that everything was alive. To think that you and I did not see, feel, think, nor bear our part. To think that we are now here and bear our part. Not a day passes, not a minute or second without an accouchement. Not a day passes, not a minute or second without a corpse. The dull nights go over, and the dull days go over. The soreness of lying so much in bed goes over. The physician, after long putting off, gives the silent and terrible look for an answer. The children come hurried and weeping, and the brothers and sisters are sent for. Medicines stand unused on the shelf. The camphor smell has long pervaded the rooms. The faithful hand of the living does not desert the hand of the dying. The twitching lips press lightly on the forehead of the dying. The breath ceases. The pulse of the heart ceases. The corpse stretches on the bed, and the living look upon it. It is palpable as the living also are palpable. The living look upon the corpse with their eyesight, but without eyesight lingers a different living and looks curiously on the corpse. To think the thought of death merged in the thought of materials, to think of all these wonders of city and country and others taking great interest in them and we taking no interest in them. To think how eager we are in building our houses, to think others shall be just as eager and we quite indifferent. I see one building the house that serves him a few years or 70 longer than slow-moving and black lines creep over the whole earth. They never cease. They are the burial lines. He that was president was buried. He that is now president shall surely be buried. A reminiscence of the vulgar fate, a frequent sample of the life and death of workmen, each after his kind. Cold dash of waves at the ferry wharf, posh and ice in the river, half-frozen mud in the streets, a gray, discouraged sky overhead, the short last daylight of December, a hearse and stages, the funeral of an old Broadway stage driver, the cortege, mostly drivers. Steady the trot to the cemetery, duly rattles the death bell. The gate is passed, the new dug grave is halted at. The living alight, the hearse uncloses. The coffin is passed out, lowered and settled. The whip is laid on the coffin. The earth is swiftly shoveled in. The mound above is flattened with the spade. Silence, a minute. No one moves or speaks. It is done. He is decently put away. Is there anything more? He was a good fellow, free-mouthed, quick-tempered, not bad-looking, ready with life or death for a friend, fond of women, gambled, ate hearty, drank hearty, had known what it was to be flush, grew low-spirited toward the last, sickened, was helped by a contribution, died, age 41 years, and that was his funeral. Thumb extended, finger uplifted, apron, cape, gloves, strap, wet weather clothes, whip carefully chosen, boss, spotter, starter, hostler, somebody loafing on you, you loafing on somebody, headway, man before, man behind, good day's work, bad day's work, pet stock, mean stock, first out, last out, turning in at night. To think that these are so much and so nigh to other drivers, and he there takes no interest in them. The markets, the government, the working man's wages, to think what account they are through our nights and days. To think that other working men will make just as great account of them, yet we make little or no account. The vulgar and the refined, what you call sin and what you call goodness, to think how wide a difference. To think the difference will still continue to others, yet we lie beyond the difference. To think how much pleasure there is. Do you enjoy yourself in the city? Or engaged in business? Or planning a nomination and an election? Or with your wife and family? Or with your mother and sisters? Or in womanly housework? Or the beautiful maternal cares? These also flow onward to others. You and I flow onward. But in due time, you and I should take less interest in them. Your farm, your profits, your crops. To think how engrossed you are. To think there will still be farms and profits and crops. Yet for you, of what avail? What will be well. Well, what is well. To take interest is well, and not to take interest is well. The domestic joys, the daily housework or business, the building of houses are not phantasms. They have weight, form, location. Farms, profits, crops, markets, wages, government are none of them phantasms. The difference between sin and goodness is no delusion. The earth is not an echo. Man in his life and all the things of his life are well considered. You are not thrown to the winds. You gather certainly and safely around yourself. 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 Forever and ever. It is not to diffuse you that you were born of your mother and father. It is to identify you. It is not that you should be undecided, but that you should be decided. Something long preparing and formless has arrived and formed in you. You are henceforth secure, whatever comes or goes. The threads that were spun are gathered. The weft crosses the warp. The pattern is systematic. The preparations have every one been justified. The orchestra have sufficiently tuned their instruments. The baton has given the signal. The guest that was coming, he waited long, he is now housed. He is one of those who are beautiful and happy. He is one of those that to look upon and be with is enough. The law of the past cannot be eluded. The law of the present and future cannot be eluded. The law of the living cannot be eluded. It is eternal. The law of promotion and transformation cannot be eluded. The law of heroes and good doers cannot be eluded. The law of drunkards, informers, mean persons, not one iota thereof can be eluded. Slow-moving and black lines go ceaselessly over the earth. Northerner goes carried, and southerner goes carried. And they on the Atlantic side, and they on the Pacific. And they between, and all through the Mississippi country, and all over the earth. The great masters in cosmos are well as they go. The heroes and good doers are well. The known leaders and inventors, and the rich owners and pious and distinguished may be well. But there is more account than that. There is strict account of all. The interminable hordes of the ignorant and wicked are not nothing. The barbarians of Africa and Asia are not nothing. The perpetual successions of shallow people are not nothing as they go. Of and in all these things I have dreamed that we are not to be changed so much, nor the law of us changed. I have dreamed that heroes and good doers shall be under the present and past law, and that murderers, drunkards, liars shall be under the present and past law. For I have dreamed that the law they are under now is enough. And I have dreamed that the purpose and essence of the known life, the transient, is to form and decide identity for the unknown life, the permanent. If all came but to ashes of dung, if maggots and rats ended us, then alarm, for we are betrayed, and indeed suspicion of death. Do you suspect death? If I were to suspect death, I should die now. Do you think I could walk pleasantly and well suited toward my own annihilation? Pleasantly and well suited I walk. Whither I walk I cannot define, but I know it is good. The whole universe indicates that it is good. The past and present indicate that it is good. How beautiful and perfect are the animals. How perfect the earth, and the minutest thing upon it. What is called good is perfect, and what is called bad is just as perfect. The vegetables and minerals are all perfect. The imponderable fluids are perfect. Slowly and surely they have passed on to this, and slowly and surely they yet pass on. I swear I think now that everything without exception has an eternal soul. The trees have, rooted in the ground. The weeds of the sea have, the animals. I swear I think there is nothing but immortality, that the exquisite scheme is for it, and the nebulous float is for it, and the coherent is for it, and all the preparation is for it, and identity is for it, and life and materials are all together for it. Thank you. No questions at a last lecture.